The old-timers claimed the desert held ghosts, but Jedediah Stone, a bounty hunter whose faith resided only in the weight of gold and the speed of his colt, knew better. He'd come for a woman, not a phantom. He stalked his latest bounty, a half-starved rustler named Cletus, not with fury, but with the detached patience of a craftsman. He saw the man's exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders, predicted the desperate veer towards a dry creek bed, and felt the shift in the loose rock under his own boot that signaled the final tired stumble. Jed didn't waste a word. The heavy thud of Cletus hitting the dust was the only conversation necessary. He secured the man's hands with practiced efficiency, the leather straps making a satisfying final zip. The gold coins the sheriff counted out into his palm felt solid, real, a predictable and comforting weight against the emptiness of the coming night. This was his world, a place of clear ledgers and settled accounts. He walked past the saloon proper, the sounds of raucous laughter and tinny piano feeling like a language from a foreign country. He headed for the back room, a place that smelled of stale beer and quiet desperation. With 3 of the newly acquired coins, he purchased the single commodity that could dull the edges of his solitude, a bottle of rye that burned like sin itself. And it was there, in that dim, suffocating room, that the old-timer made him the second offer. A bargain was struck, not in gold, but in whiskey. 1 bottle for 1 Apache bride. He'd led her out into the blinding sun, a silent, beautiful creature with eyes that held the emptiness of the entire desert. She wore a simple deerskin dress and moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the muddy, chaotic street. He hadn't been looking for a wife. He was a man buying a moment of warmth against the coming cold, a temporary shield against the ghosts of his own making. He told himself it was just another transaction, a simple entry in the ledger. But that night, miles from any town, the silence was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of his solitude. It was an active, watchful presence. He built a small fire, its light pushing back against a darkness that felt alive and immense. She sat across from him, motionless, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He had expected fear, or anger, or defiance. He saw only a profound stillness that unnerved him more than any weapon ever could. He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, the burn in his throat a familiar friend. Then she moved. It was not a tentative gesture, but a single, fluid act of purpose. She stood, and in the flickering light of his campfire, her deerskin dress fell to the dirt, not by his hand, but by hers. And he saw it. Jedediah froze, the whiskey bottle halfway to his lips. This was not the soft, unmarked skin of a frightened girl. Woven into the flesh of her back, from her shoulders to the small of her waist, was a map of exquisite, terrifying detail. Rivers and canyons etched in faded black ink, landmarks he recognized with a sickening lurch in his gut, a map leading straight into the heart of Comanche territory, to a place marked only with the stark, grinning skull of a devil. A place he'd sworn on his mother's grave he'd never go again. The warmth he had purchased fled into the cold desert night, replaced by a dread so profound it felt like a physical weight. The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the darkness, each one a tiny, dying star. This wasn't a purchase, this wasn't a bargain, this was a summons. He looked from the map on her skin to the empty horizon, the same horizon he had fled from all those years ago. And the choice, he realized with a cold, terrifying clarity, wasn't whether to follow the map to his doom, but whether he could possibly outrun it. He knew, as he stared into the unblinking eyes of the woman who was no longer his property, but his fate, that dawn would not bring an escape, only a beginning. The nearest town, and the life he thought he knew, had never felt so far away. The town of Redemption was a liar. It promised civilization, but smelled of dust and desperation. To Jedediah, it was meant to be an endpoint, a place to unload his silent, damnable cargo and ride away. He kept Nita a careful horse length behind him, feeling the weight of her presence like a storm cloud at his back. The plan was simple: leave her with the preacher, forfeit the whiskey money, and erase the whole damnable bargain from his ledger. He could almost taste the freedom. That's when he saw it. A flicker of sunlight off something that didn't belong, the silver concho on a saddle, too clean for this town. He didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he pulled Nita from her horse, half dragging her into the narrow gap between the blacksmith's forge and the assayer's office. The world erupted. A rifle shot splintered the wood where her head had been a second before. 3 men, hard-faced and moving with the practiced ease of hired muscle, spread out to flank them. They weren't aiming to kill. Their rifles were pointed low, meant to cripple, to capture. Jedediah's mind worked with cold, beautiful clarity. He saw the angle of the sun, the position of the water trough, the rhythm of their advance. He shoved Nita deeper into the alley, his Colt already in his hand. "Stay down," he growled, the first words he'd spoken to her all day. The first shot was a symphony of competence, a puff of dust from the shoulder of the lead man, sending him spinning. The second was a calculated ricochet off the blacksmith's anvil, a screaming hornet of lead that made the other 2 dive for cover. He was a master of his craft, a terrifying thing to behold. But as he aimed for the third man, a fourth emerged from the shadows behind him, a knife held in a low, wicked grip. Jedediah never saw him. He only heard a whisper of movement, a sound like a hawk striking from above. Nita moved past him in a blur. She held a heavy blacksmith's hammer, and she swung it not with the wild panic of a victim, but with the brutal, focused grace of a warrior. The hammer met the man's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The knife clattered to the ground. The man screamed. Nita didn't even look at him. She looked at Jedediah, her eyes blazing, and in that moment he saw the truth. She was no helpless cargo. She was as much a predator as he was. The thought of abandoning her, of leaving this woman to be hunted by men like these, was no longer just a bad business decision. It was a death sentence he refused to sign. The simple transaction was over. This was something else entirely, something tangled and deadly, and the only way out was forward. They found refuge in a shallow cave carved by an ancient river, a hidden wound in the red rock of the canyonlands. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. Jedediah cleaned his Colt with methodical precision, the familiar clicks of the mechanism a comforting ritual in a world that had lost its axis. He had saved her, and she had saved him. The ledger was balanced, but the debt felt deeper than ever. He will not stop. The voice startled him. It was low and clear, without the rasp of disuse he'd expected. Nita sat by the mouth of the cave, her silhouette framed against the dying light. For the first time, she looked at him not as a captor, but as a reluctant partner. "Who is he?" Jedediah asked, his voice rough. "The man who sent them, the man who owns the valley now, Elias Thorne." Jedediah's blood ran cold. The name was a ghost, a specter from a past he had buried under a mountain of gold and cynicism. "Thorne is dead," he said, the words feeling like a lie in his own mouth. "No," Nita said, her voice cutting through the twilight. "He survived. My people found him, broken and dying, after you fled. They healed him." She paused, letting the weight of his old sin fill the space between them. "And he repaid them by leading the men who burned our village and slaughtered our elders. He took the valley that was never his to take." The cave felt small, suffocating. The air was thick with the ghost of his own cowardice. He finally understood. This was no random bargain, no chance encounter. He had been chosen. "Why me?" he whispered, the question he had been afraid to ask. "Because you were there," she said, her eyes pinning him to the stone wall. "Because you are the only other man who knows the truth of that place. The map on my back is the story of my people, of their land and their murder. My vow, made to my grandmother as she lay dying, was to make the man who betrayed them witness it, to make him see what he destroyed. He is the end of the map. You. You are the key to open it." The world shifted. He wasn't the owner, the protector, the bounty hunter. He was a tool, a key, a piece in a game of justice so profound it made his own life feel small and insignificant. He looked at her, at the quiet, unbreakable strength that emanated from her, and felt the terrifying implication of her words settle in his bones. His path forward was no longer his own. It led directly through the heart of his deepest shame, guided by the hand of a woman who was not his captive, but his judge. Days later, they found a fragile sanctuary in the crumbling adobe walls of an old Spanish mission, a place of peeling paint and lingering prayers. The respite was a lie. Thorne's men found them at dusk, a relentless tide of violence. The fight was brutal, a desperate dance of survival among the cracked clay pots and withered gardens. Jedediah fought with a fury he hadn't felt in years, not for gold, but for the ghost of his own honor. In the chaos as he reloaded, his leather satchel was torn from his horse, its contents spilled across the dusty courtyard. And Nita saw it. Gleaming dully in the last rays of sunlight, nestled amongst his spare ammunition, was a small brass compass. It was old, dented, and familiar. Terribly, horribly familiar. She had seen it once before, in the hands of the man who led the slaughter, the man who had walked through her village as a guest before becoming its destroyer. Thorne. Her face, which had begun to show the first signs of a fragile trust, became a mask of stone. The brief unspoken alliance between them shattered into a million pieces. To her, this wasn't just a compass, it was a trophy, it was proof. Proof that the man who had pretended to protect her was one of them, a part of the original sin. As Jedediah turned, finally driving off the last of the attackers, he saw her backing away. Her eyes were filled not with fear, but with a cold, absolute loathing that cut him deeper than any blade. Taking advantage of his momentary confusion, she slipped through a crumbling archway and vanished into the deepening shadows. He was left standing alone in the silent, corpse-strewn courtyard, defeated and utterly, completely abandoned. He looked down at the compass on the ground, the symbol of the failure that had haunted him his entire life, now the very thing that had cost him his only chance at redemption. The silence that rushed in to fill the space she had left was a crushing, final weight. The silence Nita left behind was a physical thing, a crushing weight that settled over the blood-soaked courtyard of the mission. For a long moment, Jedediah Stone didn't move. He was no longer a bounty hunter, no longer a protector. He was just a man, standing in the ruins of his own making, the taste of ash in his mouth. He looked at the bodies of Thorne's men, dead not for gold, but for a lie. His gaze fell upon the brass compass on the ground. It gleamed, innocent and damning. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and picked it up. The metal was cool against his skin. For years, this object had been his shield, a tangible proof of his cynical worldview. Every man is out for himself, and survival is the only law. But as he held it, turning it over in his hand, the metal seemed to warm, the memories rising unbidden. He saw Thorne not the monster, but the young, hopeful prospector, laughing by a campfire, tracing their future on a crude map with that very compass. He felt the rumble of the earth, the primal terror of the Comanche attack, and the cold, sharp decision to run. To survive. His cynicism, he saw with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, wasn't a strength. It was a shield, a brittle, hollow thing he had built to protect himself from the shame of that single defining moment of cowardice. Nita's mission wasn't just about vengeance against Thorne. It was about legacy. It was about ensuring her people's story wasn't erased by a murderer's ambition. It was about building something that would last. Vengeance was an ending. Legacy was a beginning. He stood up, his body feeling both older and lighter. He couldn't outrun his doom. The thought was no longer terrifying, but liberating. But he could redefine it. Thorne was a man obsessed with the veneer of civilization, a monster who used contracts and deeds as weapons. A bullet would be justice, but it wouldn't be victory. Victory was not destroying Thorne's life, but dismantling his legacy, piece by legal, irrefutable piece. He looked towards the path Nita had taken, not with the eyes of a tracker, but of a man with a new, terrifyingly clear purpose. He had to find her, not to possess her, but to become her weapon. He found her 3 days later, not in a defensible canyon, but by a sacred spring, a place of stillness and memory. She didn't draw a knife. She simply watched him approach, her eyes holding the cold, hard weight of betrayal. It was his, Jedediah said, his voice raw. He stopped a respectful distance away, holding out the compass. His name was Elias Thorne. We were partners. He gave this to me the day we struck gold. When the Comanche came, I ran. I left him for dead. He laid the compass on a flat rock between them, the brass glinting in the sun. I didn't take it as a trophy. I carried it as a penance. Nita watched him, her expression unreadable. Her silence was a crucible, burning away his pride, his excuses, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. He is a man of paper and ink, Jedediah continued, his gaze steady. He uses the law as a shield for his sins. A bullet gives him a quick death, but it buries the truth with him. The law, Nita, the law can give him a living death. It can strip him of his name, his land, his legacy. It can make him nothing. He took a breath. Your vow was to make him witness what he destroyed. Let him witness it in a federal courtroom. Let your story be entered into a record that can never be erased. He had nothing left to offer but the truth. He stood before her, not as a bounty hunter, but as a penitent, his entire future held in the balance of her gaze. The hearing was held not in a grand hall, but in the dusty makeshift courtroom of a frontier town. The circuit judge, a weary man with eyes that had seen too much, presided. Elias Thorne sat flanked by his lawyers, a portrait of civic virtue, his face a mask of composed indignation. He saw Jedediah and offered a cold, triumphant smile. Then Nita walked in. She wore a simple deerskin dress. She moved with a silent, regal grace that commanded the attention of every man in the room. She stood before the judge, and with Jedediah at her side, she turned and showed the court her back. Jedediah spoke, his voice clear and steady, and as he did, he translated the map that was her skin. He told the story of her people, of the valley they had called home for 1,000 years. He traced the lines of the sacred places, the hunting grounds, the burial sites. Then, he told the story of the massacre, of the names of the dead, each one a tiny, deliberate mark woven into the tapestry of her skin. He pointed to a small, jagged scar near her shoulder. And this, he said, his voice ringing with unshakable authority, is the mark left by the blade of the man who led them, the man who was saved by her people, the man they called a friend. The final piece was the compass. He placed it on the judge's bench. This belonged to Elias Thorne, Jedediah stated. He gave it to me himself. It places him in that valley at that time, a fact he has denied under oath. Thorne's composure finally broke. His carefully constructed world of lies and legal documents crumbled against the irrefutable truth written on a woman's body. His legacy was not of a builder, but of a butcher, erased not by a bullet, but by a story that could no longer be silenced. In the falling action of that day, as Thorne was led away in chains, Jedediah and Nita stood on a bluff overlooking the town. He held the old brass compass in his hand one last time, then, without ceremony, he let it fall, watching it disappear into the canyon below. Years later, the light is different. It is the soft, golden light of late afternoon, filtering through the leaves of young cottonwood trees. The valley, once the site of a massacre, is now a sanctuary. A school, built of river stone and sturdy pine, stands at its heart. Inside, Jedediah Stone, his face softer, his eyes clear, stands beside Nita. They are not alone. They are surrounded by a small group of children, Apache, Navajo, even the pale-faced son of a local homesteader. On a large slate chalkboard is not a map of the earth, but a map of the heavens. Nita points to a cluster of stars with a long willow branch, her voice no longer a weapon, but a gentle guide. Jedediah watches her, and in that moment he feels the last ghost of his past finally fade away. He had thought survival was about saving his own skin, but now he knew true survival was about having a soul worth saving, about building a future that would shine long after he was gone.